Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of concerns I want to raise. I think I participated in close to 2.5 years of hearings on climate change before this subcommittee. We have a 648-page draft that we're looking at right now. This is a huge piece of legislation. This is an exceptionally complicated issue. And I am concerned of moving so quickly that we go to markup next week, we may not get it right. And I just want to make sure that we are deliberate in how we go about this. The draft has, as many members have pointed out, a significant hole right now in terms of how we're going to address the issue of allowances. So I just want to express that concern. Second, major or landmark legislation that has been passed through this Congress historically in terms of environmental issues has often had a bipartisan component. I believe good policy on this subject should be bipartisan. I implore all members on this committee, on both sides of the aisle, to step up to the plate on this issue. It's a serious issue, and everybody ought to get engaged. Third, the idea, if your goal is to reduce carbon emissions, and you talk about cap and trade, one of the things that people like about cap and trade is it provides a certainty about how the emissions will be reduced year to year and allows the marketplace to decide the most efficient way to go about doing that. But then we have other sections in this bill where Congress starts to dictate how we're going to reach these emission reductions. Now, we ought to have a discussion in this committee about if and when that is appropriate. We've got a renewable electricity standard here. We've got renewable fuel standards. We've talked about an energy efficiency standard. Those all are good discussions to have. But in the context of a cap and trade, where people want to let the marketplace decide how to achieve emission reductions, how far should Congress go in stovepiping down into specific issues as well and mandating what happens? Next issue. I want to talk about targets that were established in this bill. It's my understanding this draft uses the high end of the targets, the most aggressive end of the targets that U.S. CAP developed for its year-by-year targets for emissions. When U.S. CAP testified for this committee, I asked, how did they arrive at these targets? What was the justification? What was the economic modeling? I haven't gotten an answer on that. That is one of the most significant aspects of any climate change bill, and this committee needs to have a discussion about that, and I hope we do that in these legislative hearings because we haven't done it yet. Number 5. I've expressed many times in hearings about this concern of what I call a potential regional income transfer. There are many ways that this can happen. It can happen through the way our allowance system is structured. It can happen through a renewable electricity standard. It can happen even through perhaps even the efficiency standard. But there are a lot of ways that that could happen. And I think from a substantive and, quite frankly, a political standpoint, that's a really important issue for this committee to understand better than it has so far. Allowances, it's been mentioned many times. We've got to figure out what we're doing with that. It's silent right now. We don't even have a bill that says how that's going to be addressed, and yet we're looking to mark up next week. RPS, 28 states in the district have an RPS already. I question whether there ought to be a federal standard, and we shouldn't instead have policy to encourage the rest of the states to do this. If there is a standard, if the goal here is really to have lower carbon emissions, then should we care how we produce the electricity if the kilowatt hour doesn't produce carbon? So why are we picking just one set of technologies? Shouldn't we include nuclear? Shouldn't we include zero emission coal as the Utah voluntary RPS does right now? Next issue, energy efficiency. That's a good thing in the Energy Efficient Resource Standard, which calls for 15% efficiency by 2020 and 10% for natural gas by 2020. That's a good thing to have, but I'm concerned that we're piling on when we're already looking at the renewable electricity standard. I also think decoupling for electricity has to be on the table. Next issue, transmission. There's nothing real for transmission in this draft. People are talking about going to 25% renewable electricity generation in this country. If we don't deal with our transmission issue, you can't do it. So we've got to get serious about transmission. Offsets. I'm pleased with the Offsets Integrity Board provision, but I think we're being unfair to businesses by trying to discount offsets. If the offsets are real, then a turning of 5 offsets for 4 reduction credits doesn't make sense to me. This should be a 1-to-1 ratio, and it should also include the Western Climate Initiative offsets. Next issue, international offsets. This should not link up with the CDM. Witnesses have testified for this committee that the international program has had major problems. Language should be tightened to preclude international offsets that are not of equivalent quality to U.S. offsets. Next issue, fuels. Renewable fuel standard. You know, this committee wasn't involved in writing the RFS that went through Congress. It wasn't written by this committee, and its feedstock mandates don't make any sense. Our corn ethanol policy is a failure, and we ought to address that issue as well. 2 more issues, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real quick as my time's running out. CAFE. I think we have to have some harmony between where federal and state policy is on this. I'm concerned about getting a checkerboard pattern of how this policy is set in this country. Last issue, where do revenues go? The president suggested revenues from auction of offsets should go to pay for the middle class tax cut. I think that's bad policy. I think that any revenues that come out of this policy need to be plowed back into the climate change set of issues. And this whole discussion about cost to ratepayers, until you identify where the money goes from the auction of some allowances, and I'm not for 100% auction, by the way, but until you figure out where those revenues go, any discussion about cost to consumers is a moot point, because we're not talking about where the money's going to come from to help mitigate those cost components. So let's address that issue as well. That was 14 quick issues, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your patience and let me go over time.
Thank the gentleman.